The Burden of Bad Ideas: How Modern Intellectuals Misshape Our Society, by Heather MacDonald. Copyright 2000 by Heather MacDonald. This full-length reading was published by arrangement with Ivan R.D. Incorporated and was produced in 2001 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. This book has 234 pages and is read by Anna Fields. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. At a Brooklyn high school, students perfect their graffiti skills for academic credit. An Ivy League law professor urges blacks to steal from their employers. Washington bureaucrats regard theft by drug addicts as evidence of their disability, thereby justifying welfare benefits. Public health officials argue that racism and sexism cause women to contract AIDS. America's premier monument to knowledge, the Smithsonian Institution, portrays science as a white man's religion. These are just a handful of examples from the upside-down world of public policy that Heather MacDonald explores in The Burden of Bad Ideas. Critics have attacked the foolishness of some of today's elite thought from many angles, but few have bothered to examine the real-world consequences of those ideas. Here, one of our best investigative journalists reports on their disastrous effects throughout our society. In closely reported stories from the streets of New York to the seats of intellectual power, Ms. MacDonald shows how bad ideas get started and then acquire a life of their own. Her reports trace the transformation of influential opinion makers, such as the New York Times, and large philanthropic foundations from confident advocates of individual responsibility, opportunity, and learning into apologists for the welfare state. The prevailing orthodoxy of ideas, she finds, has affected our law schools, our schools of education, our museums, even our schools of public health, with ruinous consequences for the teaching of our children. Ms. MacDonald argues that our policies grow out of a powerful set of ideas that have governed the public debate for decades, the product of university faculties and a professional elite who are convinced that America is a deeply unjust society. And while these beliefs have damaged the nation as a whole, she observes, they have hit the poor especially hard. In writing on poverty and education, the reality I have observed again and again in welfare offices and urban classrooms, she notes, is so dissimilar from that presented in the mainstream media that I sometimes wonder whether their reporters and I occupy the same universe. When it comes to urban problems and social policy, the burden of bad ideas is more than a breath of fresh air. It's a cold shower. Heather MacDonald is a John M. Olin Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor to City Journal, the quarterly magazine of urban affairs where most of the pieces in this book originated. She is a non-practicing lawyer who has degrees in English from Yale and Cambridge universities. She lives and works in New York City. Introduction. I once asked a mother on food stamps what she would do without them. "I'd get a husband," she replied matter-of-factly. Here was news, I thought, a tantalizing bit of evidence of welfare's corrosive effect on the inner-city family. But when I recounted this exchange in an article for one of the nation's most influential newspapers, the editor ordered me to leave it out. Quoting it, he said, would stigmatize the poor. This episode perfectly crystallizes my experience of writing on poverty and education. The reality I have observed again and again in welfare offices and urban classrooms across New York and elsewhere is so dissimilar from that presented in the mainstream media that I sometimes wonder whether their reporters and I occupy the same universe. Maybe this is a matter of my background. I came to writing about urban problems and social policy an innocent, without a preconceived theory about the neighborhoods that have dominated domestic policy debate for almost half a century now. I wanted to know not only about people's experience growing up and living in the inner city, but also their opinions about their community's problems and government's efforts to solve them. Three things struck me above all. First was the depth of dysfunction that I often saw, the self-destruction wrought by drugs and alcohol and promiscuity, the damage inflicted on children by a world from which the traditional family had largely disappeared, though throughout the most troubled neighborhoods I found individuals of extraordinary moral strength fighting for order. Second was the extent to which government programs shaped life in the ghetto, influencing the choices that individuals made and distorting the forms that social interaction took. Finally, I was continually amazed by the trenchancy with which those I interviewed could judge their situations and the policies that had gone into making them. If you want to know how well social policies are working, I learned, ask the poor when their advocates aren't around. After a couple of years visiting welfare hotels, public housing projects, and schools in that 3-borough-wide band of educational failure known in New York as the Dead Zone, I increasingly understood that my initial lack of preconception accounted for the difference between what I saw and what the conventional press reported about the same subjects. I wanted to see firsthand as much as I could, and then, as faithfully as I could, to render what I saw. Too many writers and commentators, it seems to me at least, are in the grip of an inflexible ideology that prevents them from seeing clearly the reality in front of their eyes, if it doesn't square with theory. It wasn't just journalists who held that ideology, of course. It informed the social policies that were misshaping inner-city life. That was the reason journalists often had such trouble accurately portraying the ghetto. They couldn't face the fact that the programs and principles they supported with such fervor didn't work. Or worse, these principles actually harmed the poor who were their supposed beneficiaries. But what gives the ideology such hold over people as intellectual and engaged as my journalistic colleagues? It assures its adherents that they are compassionate and caring, merely by virtue of subscribing to it. It gives them a sense of specialness, even though its core ideas have formed the nation's elite orthodoxy for decades. And indeed, these orthodox ideas have permeated the nation's elite institutions so thoroughly that it is difficult to escape their sway. I was fascinated to observe and to report on how they had transformed such cultural bastions as the New York Times and the great philanthropic foundations that for more than a generation have helped set America's social and cultural agenda. I looked at how they had transformed our law schools, our education schools, our museums, even our public health schools, with further consequences for public health policy and for how school children are taught. And finally, I traced how this reigning intellectual orthodoxy affected the press's coverage of the shooting of Amadou Diallo by 4 New York police officers, and what effect this cause célèbre had on law enforcement in New York. The more I learned, the more I understood how it could be that the fact that something was true, a welfare mother's damning admission regarding welfare and family structure, say, came to matter less than maintaining certain false but ego-massaging ideas about poverty, social responsibility, and race. What are these destructive and blinding ideas? First among them is the notion that the poor cannot be held responsible for their own behavior, because they are victims of an unjust and racist American society. Buttressing this idea are a series of corollaries: that government can assume the role of parents, that America's ineradicable racism and sexism require double standards for minorities, that reason is a tool of male oppression, and that education is not about knowledge, but ethnic empowerment. How do these ideas skew the presentation of reality in the mainstream press, beyond simply suppressing it like the editor described above? Late last year, the New York Times held up a young woman named Eve Engesser as a poster victim of New York's allegedly heartless policies toward the homeless. Miss Engesser faced eviction from her public shelter accommodation, as well as temporary separation from her children, because of her failure to follow the state's new shelter work requirements. The Times quoted a local minister approvingly. "They set these people up to fail," he fumed, "and then they sanction them when they do fail." But this is very far from the truth. They didn't set Miss Engesser up to fail. She created her own failure. She had her first child at age 13 with another 13-year-old who promptly disappeared. Her second child came 4 years later by an equally temporary.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?